Winter 1943. The Eastern Front is on fire. The Soviet Red Army, relentless in its advance, has pushed the Germans to the brink of collapse. Kharkov, a vital industrial hub and the jewel of the Southern Front, has fallen to Soviet hands. But Germany is not ready to give up. Enter the Waffen-SS. Among them, the most elite division Germany has ever fielded, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, alongside the 2nd SS Das Reich and the 3rd SS Totenkopf. These soldiers, hardened by years of war, are now tasked with a near impossible mission: retake Kharkov and regain the initiative for the upcoming summer. Commanded by the infamous Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, these elite divisions must launch a brutal counteroffensive, fighting through harsh winter conditions, fierce Soviet resistance, and overwhelming odds. The very fate of the Eastern Front hangs in the balance. This is the story of the Third Battle of Kharkov, the battle that would decide whether Germany could stop the Red Army's momentum, and if the Red Army could push back the invaders. This would become a fight for survival. On February 6, 1943, a thick blanket of snow covered the steppes surrounding Kharkov, a key city in northeastern Ukraine. Soldiers from Major Kurt Meyer's reconnaissance battalion of the SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler huddled for warmth in the biting cold. Their half-tracks and assault guns were carefully concealed in a wooded area near the village of Malinovka, which lay on the eastern bank of the Donets River, not far from the Chuguyev railway station. Outside, the wind howled fiercely across the desolate landscape, while the men kept mostly silent, watching as Russian tanks and infantry steadily approached, leading the head of a large column. Meyer had given strict orders to the crews of the scattered vehicles, instructing them to hold their fire until he gave the command. His mission was critical: to cover the retreat of what remained of the shattered German 298th and 320th Infantry Divisions, both of which had been decimated by the Soviet forces during a massive offensive along the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The success of this operation depended on Meyer's ability to maintain control and strike at the opportune moment. Earlier that same morning, about 1,400 survivors from the two ravaged German divisions had staggered through Malinovka, making their way toward the relative safety of the main German lines near Chuguyev. Their condition was pitiful. Many of them were frostbitten, with blackened fingers and toes, barely clinging to life in the brutal winter conditions. Wrapped in whatever blankets and rags they could find, these soldiers were a far cry from the relatively fresh and well-equipped Panzer Grenadiers under Meyer's command, who had arrived in the region by train less than a week prior. The landscape surrounding the village gradually sloped upward, giving the German gunners an advantageous position with a clear view of the advancing Russian forces. The enemy's column appeared stark against the winter sky as they moved closer. Soviet T-34 and KV-2 tanks led the way, grinding through the snow with slow but deliberate movements, while infantry in brown uniforms cautiously followed, using the massive tanks as cover against any potential ambush. Meyer knew that timing would be everything. Meyer recalled vividly, "We watched the shadows of Russian tanks slowly advancing westward on both sides of the road," he later wrote. "The tanks avoided the road, winding across the rugged terrain, clearly attempting to encircle our bridgehead and crush it in their armoured jaws." His observations reflected the grim reality of the situation. The Soviet forces were closing in, determined to sever the German retreat and trap the remaining troops in a deadly vice. Despite the ominous approach of the Russian tanks, Meyer's battalion remained resolute. They were bolstered by the presence of 88mm anti-aircraft guns positioned on the west bank of the Donets River at Chuguyev, formidable weapons capable of piercing the thick armour of even the heaviest Soviet tanks. With the combined strength of his armoured vehicles and the artillery support from across the frozen river, Meyer knew they had more than enough firepower to deal a devastating blow to the advancing Soviet column. The situation, though tense, was far from hopeless. Radio silence maintained for the sake of stealth was occasionally broken as officers from various points reported on the progress of the Russian advance. Updates flowed in, each one confirming the steady approach of the Soviet forces. The Red Army soldiers, drunk with victory, were about to sign their own death warrant, Meyer wrote. I maintained contact with all units, either by radio or telephone. Each unit was ready to react instantly and was confident in its strength. They had not been overwhelmed by fear of the Russians. His battalion's discipline and preparation were key. Every crew, despite the freezing conditions and the intimidating sight of Soviet tanks, was prepared to spring into action the moment Meyer gave the signal. They were confident, not just in their firepower, but in their ability to hold their positions and protect the retreating remnants of the German infantry divisions. The Soviets, advancing with the arrogance of assumed victory, were unknowingly walking into a trap meticulously set by Meyer and his men. Meyer waited patiently as the Russian attackers crept closer, biding his time until they were dangerously near the German positions. When they reached just 150 meters away, he finally gave the order to open fire. The moment the command was issued, shells from the German anti-tank guns and armoured vehicles streaked toward the advancing Russians, catching them completely off guard. In an instant, the battlefield was transformed into chaos. Russian tanks, previously moving steadily forward, were soon engulfed in smoke and flames, immobilized in the snow. The infantry following behind the tanks were cut down in a hail of gunfire, their bodies littering the frozen ground. The harvest of death was grisly, Meyer later wrote, capturing the brutality of the scene. The firefight was brief but intense. Meyer's battalion, though vastly outnumbered, emerged with minimal losses, just 17 casualties. In contrast, the Russian forces suffered devastating losses, with 250 men killed and several tanks destroyed. This small but successful skirmish was a crucial delaying action for the Germans, though it was only a minor setback for the overwhelming Soviet forces under Colonel General Philip Golikov's Voronezh front. The larger Soviet offensive in the region was relentless, part of a massive push across southern Russia. The Voronezh front was one of 3 Soviet fronts that launched offensives against the Germans in early February 1943. The timing was significant as it coincided with the collapse of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, marking a pivotal shift in the Eastern Front. Since December 21, 1942, Golikov's forces had been engaged in continuous combat, advancing southward without pause. Their relentless push was part of Operation Star, aimed at recapturing strategic cities like Kursk and Kharkov. Kharkov, in particular, was a key industrial and transportation hub in northeastern Ukraine, making it a prime target for the Soviet High Command, Stavka. Stavka believed that after the defeat at Stalingrad, the German forces in southern Russia were demoralized and vulnerable. They ordered Golikov's Voronezh front, along with Colonel General Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front and Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko's southern front, to press the attack. The goal was ambitious, to outflank and encircle the German forces, cutting off their access to vital bridges over the Dnieper River, trapping them in Ukraine. However, the scale of the operation was so vast that Soviet planners overlooked critical logistical challenges, straining their forces as they advanced. On January 23rd, Golikov was tasked with capturing Kharkov. His initial orders were straightforward, but 3 days later, Stavka expanded his mission to include the capture of Kursk, 200 kilometers to the north. Kharkov was not only the second largest city in Ukraine, but also a vital rail junction, making it a prime objective for both sides. As Soviet pressure mounted, the German High Command scrambled to reinforce Army Detachment Lance, which was responsible for defending the area from Belgorod to Izium. covering all the main approaches to Kharkov. Colonel General Maximilian Weichs, commanding Army Group B, oversaw the defence of the region. General Hubert Lanz, who led the army detachment named after him, reported directly to Weichs. To strengthen Lanz's overstretched forces, reinforcements began to arrive. Among the first was Major General Walter Hörnlein's Grossdeutschland Division, a motorised unit that had undergone a rapid reorganisation before being deployed to the area in mid-January. Additionally, the newly formed SS Panzer Corps under Lieutenant General Paul Hauser was sent to bolster the defence. This corps included some of the most elite units in the German military, the Das Reich, Leibstandarte and Totenkopf Panzer Grenadier divisions. Despite the influx of reinforcements, Lanz's forces were a mixed bag. While the Grossdeutschland Division and the SS Panzer Corps were well equipped with half-tracks and trucks that allowed for rapid movement, many of the infantry divisions such as the 168th, 298th and 320th lacked the same mobility. These divisions still relied on horse-drawn artillery and had no mechanised transport for their soldiers, limiting their ability to react swiftly to Soviet advances. In contrast, the Grossdeutschland Division's mobility allowed it to respond to threats quickly, giving the Germans a slight edge in flexibility despite being heavily outnumbered by the advancing Soviet forces. Golikov deployed 3 of his 5 armies for the assault on Kharkov, each with a distinct role in the operation. Lieutenant General Kirill Moskalenko's 40th Army was ordered to advance toward Belgorod and upon capturing it moved southwest to encircle Kharkov from the north. In the centre, Lieutenant General M.Y. Kazakov's newly formed 69th Army was tasked with advancing directly on Kharkov, securing key bridgeheads across the Donets River and pushing into the city from the east. The most formidable force, Lieutenant General Pavel Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army, was to cross the Donets south of Kharkov and encircle the city from the south. The 2 flanking pincers, Moskalenko's northern forces and Rybalko's southern tanks, were meant to converge at Lyubotin, a critical railroad town southwest of Kharkov. From the Soviet offensive starting point to Kharkov, the distance was about 120 kilometers, with multiple key strategic points along the way. Golikov's troops, numbering around 200,000, outnumbered Lanz's 50,000 men. However, the Soviet rifle divisions had been weakened by continuous combat, with their average strength reduced to between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. The 3 Soviet armies advancing on Kharkov were supported by approximately 315 tanks, with another 300 in reserve. On the German side, they had roughly 200 tanks, most concentrated in the elite SS Panzer Grenadier divisions. However, the Grossdeutschland Division was severely under strength in armour, with only 31 tanks available, more than half of which were in need of repairs. One significant advantage the Germans held was their air superiority, which allowed their Stuka dive bombers to launch tactical strikes against advancing Soviet tanks and infantry. As Operation Star began, the structure of Army Detachment Lanz was still being established. Corps Kramer, composed of the 168th and Grossdeutschland divisions under Lieutenant General Hans Kramer, was assigned to protect Kharkov from the north. The SS Panzer Corps, including the Das Reich and Leibstandarte divisions, arrived just as the Soviet offensive began, defending the city from the east and south. Both SS divisions immediately deployed to block the Soviet advance and operated closely together, often sharing armour and infantry. The Totenkopf division didn't arrive near Kharkov until 10 days after the battle had started. Meanwhile, southeast of Kharkov, Colonel Herbert Michaelis's 298th Infantry Division held positions along the Oskol River, covering the area from Kupiansk to Senkovo, while Lieutenant General Georg Postel's 320th Infantry Division covered from Senkovo to Izium. Golikov's ambitious timeline called for Kazakov's 69th Army to secure crossings over the Donets River near Volchansk by February 5th. However, the right wing of Kazakov's army, composed of the 161st and 219th Rifle Divisions, encountered fierce resistance early in the offensive. German forces had turned Veliko-Mikhailovka into a stronghold, and intense fighting ensued for 3 days before the Germans, determined to delay the Soviets as long as possible, withdrew through a narrow corridor on February 6th. On the left wing, Kazakhov's 180th and 270th Rifle Divisions initially faced light resistance, but soon encountered the seasoned troops of Colonel Heinz Harmel's Deutschland Regiment, part of Major General Georg Kepler's Das Reich Division. Harmel's regiment defended a 30-kilometer front east of the Donets River, stalling the Soviet advance. On February 5th, the situation escalated when Colonel Otto Kumm's Der Führer Regiment reinforced Harmel's left flank. The following day, Kumm launched a bold counterattack against Major General I.Y. Maloshitsky's 180th Rifle Division, pushing the surprised Soviets back by 8 kilometers and forcing them to spend the next day regaining lost ground. After the grueling battle at Velikomikhailovka, Kazakov redirected the bulk of his forces from the right wing to concentrate on capturing Volchansk. The 69th Army finally seized the town on February 9th, 4 days behind schedule. This delay was partly due to the flanking movements of Moskalenko's 40th Army, which captured Belgorod on the same day, forcing Lanz to order Kepler's Das Reich regiments to retreat across the Donets River. At the start of Rybalko's attack, his right wing encountered stiff resistance from Colonel Heinz Harmel's grenadiers in a fierce battle for the village of Veliki Burluk. Harmel's defence was bolstered by the arrival of Colonel Otto Kumm's regiment, enabling a counterattack against Major General M.N. Mokovchuk's 48th Guards Rifle Division. Frustrated by the Germans' tenacious defence, Rybalko ordered Koptsov's 15th Tank Corps to engage Harmel's resolute grenadiers. Meanwhile, Rybalko's 6th Guards Cavalry Corps and Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps continued their advance toward the wide bend in the Donets River south of Kharkov, pressing forward despite the fierce resistance. As Rybalko's attack unfolded, Lieutenant General Joseph Sepp Dietrich's Leibstandarte division arrived at Chuguyev by train. Wasting no time, Dietrich sent elements of his division, including Meyer's reconnaissance battalion and portions of Colonel Fritz Witt's 1st Regiment across the Donets River. Their mission was to assist in covering the retreat of the battered 298th and 320th Infantry Divisions, which had been decimated in the face of the Soviet offensive. By February 4th, Rybalko's tank units had secured parts of the eastern bank of the Donets, but they needed to wait for their infantry and heavy artillery to catch up before launching a full-scale attack across the river. By February 9th, Koptsov's 15th Tank Corps was poised to cross the Donets at Pechenegi, while Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps prepared for a similar crossing at Chuguyev. Rybalko ordered Sokolov to move his forces downstream to attempt an unopposed crossing at Zmiev, hoping to exploit any weaknesses in the German defences. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Kirill Moskalenko's 40th Army was delayed by the need to finish off the remnants of the Hungarian Second Army, and only began its southwestward advance toward Belgorod on February 3rd. With Operation Start already several days in motion, Golikov, concerned about the slow progress of Kazakhov's 69th Army and Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army, urged Moskalenko to accelerate his offensive. In response, Moskalenko formed mobile groups by pairing 2 independent tank brigades with rifle divisions, increasing their ability to move quickly and strike German positions with greater force. The defence of Belgorod fell to the German 168th Infantry Division. However, it became evident to General Hubert Lanz that his 168th Division was outmatched by the advancing Soviet forces. To prevent a total collapse, Lanz ordered the division to withdraw west of Kharkov to Tomarovka, where it could block Moskalenko's right wing. To fill the gap at Belgorod, Lanz redeployed the 2 regiments of the Grossdeutschland Division further west, with the Grenadier Regiment covering Kharkov's northern approaches, and the Fusilier Regiment defending Belgorod. By February 7th, Moskalenko's mobile units had reached the outskirts of Belgorod, triggering intense fighting for 2 days. On February 9th, the Germans were forced to abandon the city, ceding control to the advancing Soviet forces. The simultaneous Soviet offensives across 3 fronts, led by Golikov, Vatutin, and Yeremenko, created a dire situation for the German forces. The responsibility for confronting the Soviet advance shifted from Army Group B Commander Colonel General Maximilian Weichs to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group Don, who was responsible for dealing with the attacks from Vatutin and Yeremenko. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Manstein secured permission from Hitler to withdraw some of his forces and reposition his armoured units without interference from the High Command. This tactical flexibility allowed Manstein to respond more effectively to the Soviet thrusts. One of the most significant outcomes of Manstein's meeting with Hitler was securing authority over Army Detachment Lance. This consolidation of command allowed Manstein to coordinate all German forces in southern Russia under his leadership. Just 5 days later, on February 12th, Manstein was appointed commander of the newly formed Army Group South, which absorbed the remnants of Army Group B. Following the catastrophic collapse of Army Group B after the Battle of Stalingrad, its dissolution marked a major restructuring of the German command on the Eastern Front. As a result, in the midst of the Soviet winter offensive of 1943, Hitler granted Manstein command over 32 divisions, tasked with holding a 700-kilometer front. Manstein's leadership during this critical period would prove pivotal in the coming battles. As the pace of the Soviet offensive on Kharkov quickened, Rybalko's forces made significant gains before Manstein could fully assume control of Army Detachment Lance. By February 7th, Sokolov's 6th Guards Cavalry Corps had crossed the Donets River at Zmev, advancing northwest through the Mza Valley toward Merefa. Despite fierce resistance from Dietrich's grenadiers, both the Soviet 12th and 15th Tank Corps had also crossed the Donets by February 10th, intensifying pressure on the German defenders. The situation for Army Detachment Lance deteriorated further after Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army established bridgeheads across the Donets. In the north, Corps Kramer was tasked with holding back Moskalenko's 40th Army, but the 168th Infantry Division had been rendered combat ineffective, leaving General Walter Hörnlein's Grossdeutschland Division to face the Soviet onslaught alone. Hörnlein stretched his forces as thinly as possible, but Moskalenko's troops, extending 40 kilometers west of Kharkov, overwhelmed the already beleaguered German defences. By February 11th, Hörnlein's reconnaissance battalion had been pushed back to the northeastern outskirts of Kharkov. Meanwhile, the Das Reich Division managed to stall Kazakov's 69th Army, with Kum's de Führer Regiment redeployed south of the city to engage Sokolov's advancing cavalry corps, while Hammel's Deutschland Regiment stayed behind to slow Kazakov's progress. On February 12th, Rybalko launched a full-scale assault across the front. Koptsov's 15th Tank Corps, supported by 2 rifle divisions, pushed east from its bridgehead at Pechenegi toward Kharkov, while Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps, accompanied by another rifle division, advanced from Chuguyev, targeting the southeastern approaches to the city. At the same time, Sokolov's 6th Guards Cavalry Corps moved in a wide arc south of Kharkov, aiming to secure vital supply routes by capturing the towns of Merefa and Novaha Vodolaga. On the night of February 11th to 12th, Colonel Jakob Fick's motorcycle battalion from the Das Reich Division, supported by Panzer IVs, launched an attack on Novaja Vodolaga, briefly driving out the Soviet forces. However, a counterattack soon forced Fick's troops to retreat. Reinforced the next day, with additional tanks from the Das Reich and Leibstandarte divisions, Fick's grenadiers recaptured the town, forcing the Soviet forces to withdraw southward. Further north, fierce fighting erupted in Rogan southeast of Kharkov, where Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps clashed with Witt's 1st Regiment of the Leibstandarte Division. The Soviets unleashed a barrage of Katyusha rockets and 120mm mortars, followed by infantry assaults supported by T-34 tanks, eventually compelling the Germans to abandon Rogan. By February 13th, the first units of the Totenkopf Division, under Lieutenant General Theodor Eicher, arrived in Poltava, 140 kilometers southwest of Kharkov. However, they would not immediately impact the battle. The following day, Koptsov's 15th Tank Corps reached the industrial district in eastern Kharkov, where brutal house-to-house fighting ensued with Dietrich's grenadiers. Meanwhile, Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps was now just 10 kilometers from the city, threatening to encircle it. Despite Hitler's direct orders to hold Kharkov at all costs, SS General Paul Hauser had no intention of sacrificing his elite corps in a futile defense. On February 14th, Hauser ordered Dietrich to demolish key bridges inside Kharkov to slow the Soviet advance. However, Manstein, who was now directing the overall defense, ordered Lance to countermand Hauser's orders and preserve the bridges, aiming to hold the city as long as possible in accordance with Hitler's wishes. To bolster the defense, Manstein appointed Colonel General Erhard Raus as the new commander of Corps Kramer, renaming it Corps Raus. Raus was tasked with commanding the remnants of the Grossdeutschland Division and the depleted 168th Infantry Division. Together with Hauser, Raus was responsible for maintaining a corridor to the southwest, should Hitler eventually permit a withdrawal. On February 14th, the SS Panzer Corps launched renewed attacks on Sudzikov's 11th Cavalry Division, forcing the Soviet troops to retreat to Ochotskaya after a fierce battle. Kums der Führer Regiment, supported by tanks and assault guns, secured the village and pushed the Soviets back to Bereka, preventing the 6th Guards Cavalry Corps from linking up with Moskalenko's 40th Army as initially planned. That same afternoon, Hauser received an urgent message from Brigadier General Herbert Wahl, the new commander of the Das Reich Division, stating that his division no longer had reserves to reinforce the breaches in its lines. Despite orders from both Manstein and Lanz to continue defending Kharkov, Hauser instructed Wahl to prepare for a tactical withdrawal to the southwest. When Lanz learned of Hauser's decision, he ordered the division to maintain its positions, but by then Hamel's Deutschland Regiment had already begun pulling back. On February 15th, Soviet forces launched renewed attacks on Kharkov, escalating the battle further. Zenkovich's 12th Tank Corps and Major General G.M. Zaitsev's 62nd Guards Rifle Division breached Kharkov's southeastern defences, engaging elements of the Leibstandarte Division. In the northern sector, Leibstandarte's forces fought a fierce defensive battle against Koptsov's 15th Tank Corps in the Factory District, while Hamel's Deutschland Regiment faced a 3-division assault from Kazakov's 69th Army. At the same time, Moskalenko's 40th Army, which had been engaged with Hernlein's Grossdeutschland Division, reached the northern outskirts of Kharkov near Red Square. To the west, Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps, operating on Moskalenko's right wing, advanced toward Lyubotin, threatening to sever the 2-kilometer-wide corridor through which Hauser hoped to withdraw Hamel's Deutschland Regiment. With the battle intensifying on all fronts and Soviet forces closing in, the fate of Kharkov hung in the balance as the Germans prepared for a potential retreat. Manstein's decision-making in the days ahead would prove crucial in determining whether the city could be held, or whether a strategic withdrawal would become inevitable. On the morning of February 15th at 11 AM, General Hubert Lanz sent a desperate message to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, detailing the increasingly dire situation inside Kharkov and requesting permission to withdraw the remaining German troops. Although Manstein was sympathetic to Lanz's plight, he hesitated to disobey Hitler's explicit orders to hold the city at all costs. Nonetheless, Manstein took action by ordering SS General Lammerding to move the Thule regiment of the Totenkopf division to Lyubotin as quickly as possible to reinforce Corps Raus, hoping to bolster the German defensive lines. As Soviet forces advanced from the north and east, converging toward Kharkov's centre, Hauser made the critical decision to pull out. At noon on February 15th, Hauser ordered Colonel Heinz Hamel to lead his Deutschland regiment out of Kharkov through the narrow southwest corridor. The retreat was perilous, with Soviet T-34 tanks in hot pursuit. However, the Germans had anticipated this and left behind a rearguard of tanks and assault guns to spring a deadly ambush. The ambush was successful, with German forces destroying 15 Soviet tanks, allowing Hamel's regiment to retreat in an orderly manner. The last German unit to leave Kharkov was the Grenadier Regiment of the Grossdeutschland Division, whose assault gun battalion held off the advancing Soviets long enough for the Grenadiers to escape in their half-tracks and trucks. Meanwhile, the fighting at Bereka continued to rage on February 15th as Kums der Führer Regiment, supported by elements of the Leibstandarte Division, which had already left Kharkov, engaged Sokolov's 6th Guards Cavalry Corps. The Germans fought fiercely to prevent the Soviets from breaking through and linking up with other Red Army forces, ensuring that the withdrawal from Kharkov remained intact. When Hitler learned that Hauser had withdrawn his SS Panzer Corps from Kharkov without permission, his initial fury was directed not at Hauser but at General Lanz. Hitler, unwilling to reprimand a high-ranking SS officer, placed the blame squarely on Lanz's shoulders. On February 16th, Hitler replaced Lanz with General Werner Kempf, renaming the formation Army Detachment Kempf. That same day, Soviet forces secured control of Kharkov, marking a significant victory for the Red Army. In response, Army Detachment Kempf regrouped, forming a new defensive line stretching from Okhtyrka to Borova. This line was designed to block any further Soviet push by the Voronezh front toward the vital Dnieper River crossings, which were crucial for supplying Manstein's army group south. Despite the Soviets' impressive gains, their forces were severely overextended. Both the Voronezh and southwestern fronts had been depleted of armour, manpower and fuel due to their rapid advance. Manstein recognised this vulnerability, even though Soviet High Command, Stavka, did not. Stavka, intent on cutting off the railroads supplying the German army, ordered Golukov's 40th and 69th armies to continue advancing toward Poltava, with Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army covering Kharitonov's right flank. However, given their weakened state, it was unlikely that the Soviets could capture and hold the Dnieper crossings. On February 17th, Hitler and his senior aides flew to Manstein's headquarters in Zaporozhye, located on the banks of the Dnieper River, for a 3-day meeting to discuss strategy. Hitler, still furious that Kharkov had been abandoned despite his orders, was determined to reinforce his position. However, even before Hitler's departure, Manstein had already reorganized his forces for a bold and daring counter-offensive. Recognizing the overextended state of the Soviet forces, Manstein saw an opportunity to strike back decisively. Manstein's primary target was Mobile Group Popov, an armoured strike force at the spearhead of Vatutin's southwestern front. Commanded by Lieutenant General Markian Popov, this mobile group consisted of 4 Soviet tank corps and had been instrumental in the Soviet winter offensive. Manstein's strategy aimed to destroy Vatutin's southwestern front, pushing the Soviets back to their starting positions east of the Donets River. To achieve this, Manstein planned a coordinated counterattack, using Colonel General Eberhard Mackensen's 1st Panzer Army and Hauser's SS Panzer Corps. Manstein's gamble, based on his ability to act swiftly and exploit Soviet weaknesses, would soon transform the situation on the Eastern Front and set the stage for a dramatic reversal of fortunes. On February 19, 1943, Hauser's SS Panzer Corps gathered near Krasnograd, preparing for a counter-offensive alongside other German formations. General Otto von Knobelsdorff's 48th Panzer Corps and General Friedrich Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps took positions northwest of Krasnoarmeyskoye, while Mackensen's 40th Panzer Corps from the 1st Panzer Army assembled south of Krasnoarmeyskoye. The stage was set for a coordinated German assault to counter the Soviet advances. In the air, Field Marshal Wolfram Richthofen's 4th Air Fleet dispatched Stuka dive bombers to target the advancing Soviet columns led by Popov and Kharitonov, weakening them ahead of the panzer attack. The Soviet spearheads had advanced dangerously close, within 25 kilometers of the Dnieper River, threatening Manstein's headquarters in Zaporozhye. Fearing a Soviet breakthrough, Manstein's staff prepared for the possibility of direct combat that day. However, Popov's battle group was critically outmatched. With only about 50 operational tanks, they were no match for the superior firepower of the German forces. Mackensen's panzers encircled Popov's forces, while Hoth's 2 Panzer Corps devastated Kharitonov's 6th Army over the next 5 days. By February 23rd, after regrouping briefly following the fall of Kharkov, Hauser's SS Panzer Corps re-entered the fight, joining the other German units in an overwhelming offensive. The 3 SS divisions swept southeast, crushing the remnants of the Soviet 6th Army. Recognizing the severity of the situation, Stavka issued new orders on February 22nd. Golikov was instructed to redirect the 69th Army toward Poltava and the 3rd Tank Army toward Krasnograd. This left Moskalenko's 40th Army isolated and tasked with defending the area around Kharkov, now facing Korf Raus alone. With less pressure on his forces, Raus took advantage of the situation, pulling the Grossdeutschland division out of the fight on February 23rd for refitting at Poltava. By February 28th, Vatutin's southwestern front was in full retreat. In an effort to relieve Vatutin's beleaguered forces, Stavka transferred Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army from the Voronezh front to the southwestern front. Vatutin ordered Rybalko to move south in a desperate attempt to open a corridor to Kharitonov's encircled 6th Army at Kegichevka, east of Krasnograd. However, this maneuver led Rybalko's forces directly into a trap. The Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions launched a ferocious counterattack, encircling and destroying Koptsov's tank corps.
I rejoined my own unit as we were preparing to go into action at Kharkov. We had taken one area after heavy combat, then it was retaken by the Russians, then we pushed them out again. There seemed to be no end to the fighting. We had to take this ground 3 times, hoping on the last time that we had secured it for good. However, our guards were surprised by the enemy in the night and the positions overrun. My section's escape was quite cunning. We had watched the Russians approach from the house we were in and decided to try to outwit them rather than outfight them. We had an interpreter with us, and he shouted out an order to us in Russian, whereupon we opened the window, leapt through it and ran off. I think the Russians were very surprised as we came through the window and ran past them. Luckily it was just one solitary Russian unit. Although we were unfortunately pushed out of this village, we only suffered a few minor casualties. Then we went into our preparatory positions for the assault on Kharkov. To me it seemed as if everything was going quite well, but that was not the case, and we were forced to withdraw with heavy losses. The High Command was not prepared to let happen at Kharkov what had occurred at Stalingrad. The renewed attack on Kharkov started on 18 February and ended on 18 March 1943. The Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions made their attack on the city itself on 6th March, and within a couple of days we had penetrated the outer defences of the city. The Russian resistance stiffened, however, and we were involved in heavy street fighting. As we entered the suburbs, I was sent back as a messenger to request more ammunition supplies. As I made my way back, I came to a fork in the road. I had to make a decision which way to take, left or right. After a moment's hesitation, I took the right fork. I went along this road for a couple of minutes and then hesitated when I saw soldiers in the distance who didn't look German. They also halted. They waved at me to come over to them, and that made my mind up. They were Russians. I took off as fast as I could and made my way back to the fork in the road. I eventually reached the supply unit and reported to the Spy-S slang, Sergeant Major. I told him I had seen some Russians. This caused quite a stir. They were only a few kilometres away from our supply units. I returned to my unit in the evening along with the ammunition supplies and a driver. By the time I got back, my unit was involved in heavy house-to-house fighting. I recall one block of houses we had to clear. An SS Oberscharführer was in front of me as we sprinted up the stairs. He disappeared through a door. When we caught up to where he had been, the door was shut and there was no sign of him. We cleared the block, but he had completely vanished. He was probably captured by the Russians. We never saw him again.
While Zenkovich's corps managed a fighting withdrawal to the northwest, Hauser's SS Panzer Corps attacked Rybalko's forces from 2 directions, inflicting heavy losses. In just 48 hours of relentless fighting, the 2 Soviet tank corps and 3 rifle divisions suffered devastating casualties. By March 5th, Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army had transitioned to a defensive posture, forming a new defensive line from Novaya Vodolaga to Ochochaje. On the same day, Kazakov's and Moskalenko's armies also halted their offensive operations, unable to sustain their advances. With the collapse of Vatutin's southwestern front, Manstein shifted his focus to the Voronezh front. He ordered the 48th Panzer Corps to move north to reinforce Army Detachment Kempf, preparing for an assault on Golikov's forces. As the Voronezh front transitioned to defensive positions, the Germans struck again, launching a fresh offensive that would continue to test the strength and resolve of Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. On March 5, 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein initiated the second phase of his counteroffensive, targeting the left flank of the Voronezh front south of Kharkov. His objective was to destroy Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army and encircle Golikov's other 2 armies east of Kharkov, cutting off their retreat. The German forces were aligned for the attack, with Army Detachment Kempf, the SS Panzer Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps leading the assault. The strike began with three powerful panzer divisions, Das Reich, Leibstandarte and Lieutenant General Walter Hunersdorf's 6th Panzer Division, hitting Rybalko's forces, who were still reorganising south of Kharkov. By March 6th, the refitted Grossdeutschland Division had joined Korps Rauss, part of Kempf's forces positioned west of Kharkov. At the same time, the Totenkopf Division, fresh from its destruction of the Soviet 15th Tank Corps, took up position on Hausser's left flank. That day, Das Reich engaged in fierce fighting to recapture the strategically vital town of Novaya Vodolaga. On March 8th, the combined efforts of the SS Panzer Corps and the 4th Panzer Army succeeded in seizing the key railroad towns of Novaya Vodolaga and Malinovka. This forced the battered remnants of Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army to retreat toward Lyubutin and Merefa. With most of his tanks destroyed, Rybalko was forced to rely on artillery to slow the German advance. At Merefa, he desperately assembled 9 artillery batteries to hold back the onrushing panzer divisions. To further the offensive, Manstein reinforced Knobelsdorff's 48th Panzer Corps with the 11th Panzer Division from the 1st Panzer Army, strengthening the German push to destroy Rybalko's forces. By March 9th, the SS Panzer Corps had captured Lyubotin, with the Leibstandarte Division encircling the town from the north and the Das Reich Division pressing in from the south. This victory opened a 20-kilometer gap between Kazakov's 69th Army and the remnants of Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army. While Knobelsdorff's forces dealt with Soviet troops at Merefa, Hausser's SS divisions prepared to join Korps Rauss in the assault to retake Kharkov. On March 10th, Korps Rauss, spearheaded by the Grossdeutschland Division, launched an attack on Moskalenko's overstretched 40th Army, advancing north to recapture Belgorod. At the same time, Hausser's SS Panzer Corps shifted west to support Rauss's forces. Dietrich's Leibstandarte division captured Dagachi with little resistance, as Moskalenko's exhausted army offered minimal opposition. This allowed Hausser's forces to outflank Kharkov and prepare for a coordinated assault on the city itself. The following day, March 11th, Dietrich's Leibstandarte division entered Kharkov from the north, while Wahl's Das Reich division advanced into the city from the west. The Soviet commandant of Kharkov, Major General A.A. Belov, redeployed his forces northward to confront the Leibstandarte division, leaving the western approaches to the city vulnerable. Das Reich took full advantage, pushing toward the city centre unopposed. On March 12th, as the situation deteriorated for the Soviets, Belov ordered his troops to withdraw eastward in a fighting retreat, effectively conceding the city to the Germans. By March 13th, Kharkov was firmly back in German hands, marking a significant turning point in the Eastern Front. In less than a month, Manstein's brilliantly coordinated counteroffensive had reversed the momentum of the Soviet winter offensives. Soviet forces in southern Russia were driven back to their starting positions, with as many as 5 Soviet armies destroyed and several others severely weakened. This dramatic reversal revitalized Army Group South and provided a significant morale boost to the German forces ahead of the upcoming Battle of Kursk, set to take place in the summer of 1943. Manstein's tactical mastery during this campaign solidified his reputation as one of Germany's most effective military commanders.
After Kharkov had fallen back in our hands, we moved to Olkany. After a few days, we were allowed back into Kharkov to the Soldatenheim, where we could be deloused and have a good wash. After a fine meal we could go to the cinema or the opera. I went to see Boris Godunov. The advance continued towards Belgorod. I can remember one incident as if it were yesterday. We were on a reconnaissance mission and all was going well until we advanced up a hill and found a Russian artillery piece at the top. The crew were not at their gun, and so we scarpered quickly before they had time to fire at us. I was in a motorcycle and sidecar combination. The driver managed to stall the engine and couldn't get it restarted. We ran to another vehicle and were given a lift back. I was particularly annoyed because I had left my camera in the sidecar. So, on the next night, the driver, another comrade and myself went back under cover of darkness on another motorcycle to retrieve it. We stopped before we reached the hill and went the rest of the way on foot. We crept along the ditch at the side of the road and finally saw our motorcycle exactly where we had been forced to leave it. We crept up to it and it started on the first kick. The Russians opened fire but we made it safely away. The motorcycle and my camera were safely recovered. The whole battalion now moved forward. With another comrade I was sent forward on a reconnaissance to see if we could spot the enemy. We eventually stopped by a haystack from where we had a good view of the terrain. We made ourselves as comfortable as possible but remained watchful and alert. In retrospect, we were being rather stupid. For having no field telephone or radio, we had no way of contacting our unit. As two German planes flew over, we stood up and waved to them. They spotted us, but thought we were Russians and came into attack. Twice they strafed us. My friend ran forward directly into the hail of bullets, but was miraculously unhurt. I threw myself to the ground and got hit by a bullet in the right thigh. I felt the warmth of the blood on my legs, and as the planes flew off, I rolled up my trouser leg and could see the bullet. Fortunately, it hadn't penetrated too deep. I dug it out myself and bandaged my leg. We made our way back and reported to the company commander. I thought I would be sent to hospital, but it was decided that the wound wasn't serious enough, and so I stayed with the unit. On the day we retook Kharkov, it was my birthday. Our company commander appeared to wish me well, bringing with him a bottle of brandy. He took a swig and then passed the bottle round and wished us a pleasant day before leaving. We certainly enjoyed having a drink and were very cheerful, until the troops started passing us carrying back the wounded from the fighting. The sight of mangled bodies sobered us up quickly and brought us back down to earth. In a sombre mood we put the bottle away, got ourselves ready, and it was back to the war again. In late March 1943, as we hunted for Russian stragglers after the successful recapture of Kharkov, I had a narrow escape. We had been combing through some woods and villages for the enemy, and I came across one Russian soldier who had been very seriously wounded. I think his legs were shattered. He lay there, the snow all around him stained with his blood. I felt very sorry for him, so as I passed by I took my field dressing from its special pocket inside my tunic and threw it to him to enable him to bandage his wounds. As I walked on, something made me turn round and look back at him. He was aiming a weapon at me, ready to shoot me in the back. Luckily, one of my friends was faster on the trigger than he was and shot him dead. You never really knew in those days just how close to death you sometimes came.
February 19th to March 15th, 1943, saw significant casualties on both sides, though Soviet losses were far more severe. German forces, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, suffered approximately 11,500 to 12,000 casualties, including 2,000 to 3,000 killed. Despite these losses, their well-executed counteroffensive allowed them to regain Kharkov and stabilize the southern front temporarily. In contrast, Soviet forces endured devastating losses, with around 80,000 to 90,000 casualties, including 15,000 to 20,000 killed, and up to 50,000 soldiers taken as prisoners of war. The Soviets also lost between 600 and 800 tanks, along with a large amount of artillery and equipment, severely weakening their position. Though the Germans succeeded in retaking Kharkov, the battle marked a costly victory, further depleting their resources and manpower in a war of attrition they could not sustain. Kharkov's importance during World War II can be attributed to several key factors, which go beyond its industrial production and extend into its strategic geography, economic significance, and political symbolism. Kharkov was one of the Soviet Union's largest and most productive industrial cities. Before the war, it had developed into a major centre for heavy industry, engineering, and military production. The city was home to a number of factories that produced tanks, planes, and other military hardware critical to the Red Army's efforts. The Kharkov tractor plant, for example, was one of the largest industrial complexes in the Soviet Union, and it played a major role in manufacturing T-34 tanks, which became pivotal in the Soviet defense. Capturing these industrial facilities would allow the Germans to not only deprive the Soviet Union of war material, but also repurpose those factories to supply the German Wehrmacht. Kharkov's industrial output also included coal, machinery, and steel, which were essential for sustaining prolonged military campaigns. The city's location in the resource-rich Donbas region made it a valuable economic asset. By controlling Kharkov, the Germans aimed to cripple Soviet war production and ensure that their own forces could exploit the resources to maintain their war effort, particularly as the German war machine was heavily reliant on maintaining access to oil, coal, and steel. Kharkov's location made it a crucial transportation hub in Ukraine. The city lay at the intersection of major railway lines that connected the northern and central parts of the Soviet Union to the south and east. These railways were essential for moving troops, supplies, and war materials to and from the front lines. For the Germans, capturing Kharkov meant gaining control of these railway lines, disrupting Soviet supply chains, and enabling rapid troop movements across the Eastern Front. Additionally, Kharkov served as a gateway to the southern regions of the Soviet Union, including the resource-rich Caucasus. Germany's strategic goal of capturing the Caucasus oil fields, which were critical to sustaining their war effort, meant that Kharkov was a necessary stepping stone in their advance. The city's control would allow the Germans to launch further offensives towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, where securing oil supplies was a primary objective of the German High Command. Aside from its logistical and economic value, Kharkov held political significance as well. It had been the capital of Soviet Ukraine from 1919 to 1934, giving it a prominent place in Soviet history and national identity. The city's capture by the Germans in 1941, followed by its repeated contests, became a symbol of the intense struggle on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, losing Kharkov was a major blow, as it was not just an economic centre, but also a symbol of Soviet resilience. For the Germans, holding on to Kharkov was a matter of pride, as it demonstrated their ability to capture and retain a key Soviet city despite strong Soviet resistance. The fact that Kharkov changed hands 4 times during the war underscores its immense strategic importance. The First Battle of Kharkov in October 1941 saw the Germans successfully capture the city, but Soviet forces did not let go easily. In the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942, the Soviets mounted a significant counteroffensive to reclaim it, but this led to one of the Red Army's worst defeats of the war due to poor planning and execution, allowing the Germans to maintain control. The Third Battle of Kharkov in early 1943 followed the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. Soviet forces briefly recaptured the city, but Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counteroffensive retook Kharkov in March 1943. This successful German counterattack delayed Soviet advances and stabilized the front for a time. However, by the summer of 1943, after the Battle of Kursk, the tide had permanently turned. In the Fourth Battle of Kharkov in August 1943, the Soviets finally recaptured the city, marking a significant step in their westward advance toward Germany. Kharkov was one of the most contested cities on the Eastern Front because of its industrial capacity, its role as a transportation hub, and its strategic location in the broader context of the war. Its capture and recapture symbolized the ebb and flow of the Eastern Front, with both sides recognizing the city's importance to their respective war efforts. The Germans sought to use it as a base of operations and a resource hub for further offensives, while the Soviets saw its recapture as vital to regaining momentum and securing their industrial heartland. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.